The war had ended, but the sound of it still lingered in the hearts of those who had survived. Across the Atlantic, the cannons had long gone silent, yet in America the silence was loud in a different way. It was a silence filled with rebuilding, with remembering, and with the uncertain rhythm of peacetime that no one quite knew how to dance to. Soldiers had returned with eyes that had seen too much and dreams that now flickered like tired lanterns. And waiting for them were streets that looked the same but somehow felt foreign, like a home rearranged while they were gone. The old cobblestone roads still glistened after the rain. The front porches still creaked in the cool evening breeze. And the women who once waved from doorways now wore faces marked with both hope and exhaustion. America in 1920 was learning how to breathe again, slowly, deeply, and a little unsure. The Great War had ended just 2 years before, and the nation stood at the edge of a new era. One foot still buried in the mud of the past, and the other stepping into a world that promised noise, color, and invention. People wanted peace, but they also wanted distraction. They wanted to feel alive again, to spend their hours in laughter instead of worry, to find new rhythms that didn't sound like marching boots. In small towns stretching across the heartland, Sundays were slow and familiar, church bells in the morning, family dinners in the afternoon, and a soft hum of conversation on porches that lasted until the stars appeared. Men smoked pipes and spoke quietly about crops and automobiles, while women spoke of new fashions, of the latest radio shows, and of sons who couldn't sleep through the night anymore. In cities like New York and Chicago, the rhythm was faster, the streets alive with horns, with footsteps, with the chatter of 1,000 ambitions colliding. Skyscrapers began to rise like iron prayers, and in the shadow of those towers, people found both comfort and unease. For every glittering new light, there was a shadow behind it, a reminder that change always carried a cost. Immigrants poured in from distant lands, their dreams packed tightly in small suitcases, while others packed their hopes into Model Ts and drove toward wherever the horizon looked kinder. Factories buzzed again, trains roared across the plains, and the hum of modernity began to drown out the echoes of the past. Yet beneath it all was an unspoken weariness, a collective fatigue that made America drowsy, like a giant just waking from a heavy sleep. Even the laughter seemed slower, softer, almost cautious, as if the country was afraid that joy, once found, might be taken away again. But joy did come, slowly and unexpectedly. It came through the radio crackle that carried dance tunes into quiet homes, through motion pictures that flickered across darkened theaters, through the new slang whispered by teenagers who wanted to sound older than their years. It came through baseball games on dusty fields and through parades that wound down main streets like moving dreams. It was as if America had decided, in its own sleepy way, to reinvent happiness. In speakeasies that had not yet been discovered, men and women whispered about laws and freedom, about what was allowed and what was ignored, but most of all, they whispered about the thrill of simply being alive in a time that felt both fragile and endless. The evenings carried the scent of tobacco and lilac, of street food and car exhaust, of something new blending with something ancient. And as the days slipped by, a quiet transformation took root. The soldiers learned to smile again, the farmers learned to rest again, and the nation vast and restless, learned how to dream again, not in fear, but in wonder. The roaring 20s had not yet begun to roar. They were only stretching, yawning, finding their voice. But in that drowsy in-between, when the night fell slow and the air carried the hum of possibility, America stood on the brink of something dazzling and dangerous, a decade that would teach it how to dance again, even if it meant forgetting, for a little while, the ghosts of what came before. As factories pushed steam into the gray morning sky and trains echoed across sleeping farmlands, there was a quiet determination in the air, the kind that came from starting over. Young men who once carried rifles now carried lunch pails. Women who had filled ammunition crates now typed letters in offices or ran shops with proud, steady hands. Radios crackled in parlors where silence once reigned, and laughter began to return to kitchens where loss had lived too long. The word progress became both a promise and a prayer, whispered by inventors, salesmen, and mothers alike. Electricity spread like sunlight, brightening streets and dreams in equal measure. Yet not everyone welcomed it. Older folks still sat by kerosene lamps, watching the young race ahead with a mix of awe and worry, wondering if all this speed might one day outrun the soul of the country itself. Still, optimism won more nights than it lost. It was in the way children skipped down sidewalks, humming tunes from gramophones, in the way barbers whistled while trimming hair, in the way strangers nodded to each other as if silently agreeing that maybe, just maybe, the worst was finally behind them. Automobiles rolled down dirt roads like small miracles on wheels, carrying lovers, families, and dreamers toward new beginnings. In places like Kansas and Ohio, street fairs brought towns together, Ferris wheels turning slow against dusky skies, fiddles playing waltzes that made people forget the world for a moment. And in every corner of the country, from the still coastlines of Maine to the glowing streets of Los Angeles, the same quiet truth settled in. America was tired, but it was ready. Ready to live, to forget, to invent, and to feel again. When the nights grew long and the moon shone over sleeping neighborhoods, it was hard to tell whether the land itself was dreaming or simply resting before the storm of joy to come. For soon the music would get louder, the lights brighter, and the laughter wild. But for now, in the calm breath of 1920, the nation lay under a blanket of recovery, not yet roaring, just whispering, half awake, half asleep, preparing to rise into a decade that would glitter with both beauty and sin. If you stood in the middle of almost any American small town in the early 1920s, you could feel a quiet pulse beneath the stillness, a rhythm that didn't rush or shout, but simply hummed, steady, familiar, content. The war had taken its toll, but Main Street was learning how to smile again. Wooden storefronts that had once been shuttered now gleamed with fresh paint. Window displays sparkled with the latest goods, radios, phonographs, shining new kitchenware, and rows of polished shoes that caught the morning sun like jewels. It wasn't the grandeur of New York or Chicago, but it had its own soft kind of glory. The heart of every town beat inside its main street, a single stretch of road where everything happened, where the day began with the smell of bread from the bakery and ended with laughter spilling from the diner's open windows. There was the barber shop with its red and white pole slowly spinning outside, the hardware store stacked with neat rows of nails and tools, the drugstore with its soda fountain and tinkling glasses, and the movie house with a marquee that changed each week, promising a new silent picture that everyone in town would come to see. The air itself seemed to carry stories of gossip shared between neighbors leaning across fences, of dreams whispered between young lovers by the creek, of small ambitions that felt large in the quiet safety of familiar streets. Life was slow, but it was not idle. There was pride in every sweeping of the porch, in every neatly folded newspaper, in every handshake that sealed a deal without the need for a contract. Sundays were the crown of the week, the day when church bells called the whole town together, when hats were dusted off and shoes were shined, and when even those who didn't believe much in sermons came just to see familiar faces and exchange soft smiles. Afterward, families would stroll down Main Street, greeting shopkeepers who stood in their doorways, wiping hands on aprons and nodding in the golden light. There was something deeply comforting about knowing every name, every habit, every quirk of a place that seemed eternal, untouched by the rush of the outside world. Yet, even in this sleepy rhythm, change was tiptoeing in, gentle but persistent. The automobile was no longer a wonder. It was becoming a fixture. Kids would chase the dust trails left by passing Fords, and fathers would talk about roads being paved all the way to the next town. Electricity was threading its way into homes, string by string, lighting kitchens and bedrooms where oil lamps once flickered. And at night, when the bulbs glowed soft and steady, people would stand in their living rooms and stare at the light, as if it were magic, as if the future itself had just stepped through the front door. Main Street was alive with the optimism of ordinary people who believed that even a small life could be grand if lived honestly and fully. Shopkeepers arranged their goods with care, adding little touches that spoke of pride, a sprig of wildflowers beside the register, a neatly handwritten sign offering credit to friends who had fallen on hard times. Children's laughter echoed through alleyways as they played with hoops and marbles, their joy unbothered by the grown-up world's worries. Teenagers lingered outside the ice cream parlor, sharing sodas with 2 straws and giggling at jokes that made no sense to anyone else. The local paperboy whistled as he pedaled past the post office, tossing rolled newspapers that landed with soft thuds on wooden porches. Dogs barked lazily in the sun, and the old clock above the town hall ticked on, steady as the heartbeat of the community itself. The smell of coffee, sawdust, and horses lingered in the air, an aroma that, for those who lived there, meant home. Yet beneath all the gentleness, there was a quiet hunger growing. The radio broadcasts coming from distant cities spoke of jazz, of theater, of inventions that sounded like miracles. Some young men dreamed of leaving, of seeing the world beyond the horizon, while others swore they would never abandon the soil their fathers had plowed. Women who had worked through the war began to crave something beyond routine, freedom, perhaps, or the thrill of a life that wasn't measured only by chores and seasons. But for now, most stayed, tethered by love, by habit, and by the slow comfort of knowing their place in the world. Each night, Main Street would fall into stillness again. Lamps dimmed behind lace curtains, and the only sound was the low hum of crickets mingling with the faint creak of the water tower in the distance. If you walked down that road at midnight, the glow of the streetlights would pool on the ground like quiet puddles of gold, and the air would carry the faint perfume of lilacs from someone's garden. The silence was not empty, it was peaceful, heavy with the knowledge that tomorrow would look much like today, and that was enough. Because in these towns, stability was its own kind of beauty, and routine was a luxury earned by those who had seen chaos. And yet, as the 1920s stretched onward, even the most content towns began to stir. Traveling salesmen brought with them stories of cities where women bobbed their hair and wore dresses that shimmered like moonlight, of nightclubs where laughter lasted till dawn, of fortunes made overnight in new industries. Main Street listened, quietly curious. The world was expanding, and its whispers reached even the smallest post office, the quietest farmhouse, the most remote general store. But the people of these towns, the bakers, the teachers, the grocers, the barbers, they held on to something precious, something fragile and almost forgotten in the rush of progress, the art of slowing down. They knew that joy could live in small things, a pie cooling on a windowsill, a dance in a barn lit by lanterns, a letter arriving from a friend now living in the city. They didn't need to roar. Their happiness was a murmur, a steady hum beneath the surface of the century's noise. And so, as America's engines of change began to turn faster, these small towns kept their own time, their own gentle heartbeat, their own dream of what it meant to live well. Not rich, not famous, but steady, grounded, simple, and free in ways that the city could never understand. And while the rest of the country raced toward modernity, the people of Main Street dreamed not of leaving, but of holding on to the kindness of neighbors, to the laughter echoing down quiet lanes, and to the soft, slow rhythm of life that made every sunset feel like the first one ever seen. By the time night fell over the cities of America in the early 1920s, something almost magical began to happen, the kind of transformation that could make even the weariest heart feel alive again. The streets came to life not with chaos, but with a rhythm, a pulse that was both human and electric. Lamps flickered on, one by one, glowing halos beneath the fog of early evening, until entire blocks shimmered like rivers of gold and silver. The world that had once been lit by candles now shimmered in 1,000 tiny suns. In New York, Chicago, Detroit, and San Francisco, the skyline began to hum, a low, thrilling murmur of engines, laughter, footsteps, and hope. It was a different kind of America now, restless, curious, and bold. The war had left behind its scars, but the city was a place that healed through movement. People walked faster, spoke louder, dreamed bigger. The sidewalks were crowded with men in crisp suits and women with bobbed hair and bright scarves that caught the light of passing streetcars. Music drifted from open windows, piano melodies from small dance halls, the distant echo of jazz spilling from secret corners where the night never truly slept. The city was alive, and in its veins ran ambition. It was a place where fortunes could be made overnight, and heartbreaks could disappear in the crowd before dawn. Vendors shouted from every corner, selling roasted peanuts, papers, and flowers. Their voices blended with the clang of trolley bells and the hiss of steam escaping from underground grates. Even the smell of the city, a mix of coal, smoke, perfume, rain, and roasted chestnuts, carried a strange allure, like the scent of something both familiar and forbidden. Skyscrapers, still new and awe-inspiring, reached upward, as if they too were dreaming of a grander tomorrow. Their steel skeletons gleamed beneath the moonlight, silent symbols of human ambition, casting long shadows over streets that pulsed with life. Inside, office windows glowed deep into the night. Typists hunched over their machines, ink-stained fingers tapping out letters that would cross the country by morning. The hum of progress was constant, and those who lived among it learned to find comfort in its music. To some, it was noise. To others, it was the song of the future. On street corners, boys sold newspapers, shouting headlines that promised both excitement and worry. Stock prices rising, prohibition arrests, baseball scores, the latest silent film stars scandal. Every page seemed to whisper that America was changing faster than anyone could keep up. Yet people loved it, the pace, the pulse, the dizzying freedom of reinvention. In the evenings, theaters filled with soft chatter and the scent of popcorn as flickering screens brought stories to life in black and white. Couples held hands in the dark, the glow of the projector painting their faces in silver. Outside, music halls pulsed with energy, trumpets, drums, and laughter echoing down alleyways where the brave and the curious gathered after hours to taste the forbidden thrill of gin and freedom. Taxi horns bleated, laughter echoed, and neon signs buzzed overhead like restless fireflies, spelling out the names of dreams. In the midst of it all, there were quiet moments too. A man walking home beneath a street lamp, hat tilted against the wind. A girl standing on a rooftop, gazing at the lights below and wondering if this was what the future looked like. A mother closing her shop for the night, sweeping the doorway as the hum of the city faded into a lullaby. These small scenes, unnoticed by most, carried the soul of the decade, the delicate balance between exhaustion and wonder, between the familiar and the unknown. The city was a teacher, whispering to its people that time would not wait for anyone, and so they moved faster, worked harder, lived louder. The radio became their companion, its crackling voice bridging miles and hearts, filling lonely apartments with the laughter of distant strangers. Women began to find new freedoms, working, voting, dressing how they pleased. The flapper's laugh became the anthem of rebellion, a soft defiance wrapped in pearls and perfume. Men, too, began to loosen their collars, drawn by the promise of nightclubs where jazz was wild and time itself seemed to sway. Yet, even in this awakening, there was fatigue beneath the glow. The noise, the rush, the endless pursuit of more. It thrilled, but it also wore people down. Those who had once come to the city with hearts full of promise sometimes found themselves sitting alone on park benches, staring at the lights and wondering where the stillness had gone. But the city didn't slow. It never did. It pulsed through every sleepless night, whispering that tomorrow would be brighter, busier, bolder. Streetcars rattled past midnight, carrying workers, dreamers, lovers, all chasing something they couldn't quite name. The moonlight glinted off wet pavement, the air heavy with the mingling of smoke and rain, and somewhere in the distance, a saxophone played a tune so soft and sorrowful it felt like the city itself was sighing. Yet no one wanted to stop the music, because even when the noise became too much, it reminded them that they were part of something vast, a symphony of human motion, of ambition and chance. The glow of streetlights became the heartbeat of the age, steady, hypnotic, eternal. And as dawn crept over the skyline, painting the towers in pale gold, the hum of the city softened into a sigh. The milkmen made their rounds, the newspaper presses slowed, and the first streetcar of the morning clattered through the mist. For a brief, fragile moment, the city slept, and in its dreams it saw the endless promise of what it could still become. It began with a rhythm, faint at first, then steady, then irresistible, the heartbeat of a new America, pulsing through the smoky rooms and narrow alleys of the 1920s. Before anyone could name it, the music had already taken over, whispering through radios, echoing down stairwells, rising from basements where trumpets and saxophones met in secret harmony. They called it jazz, though it was more than music. It was rebellion set to melody, the sound of a country shaking off its sleep. In New Orleans, where the Mississippi carried stories thicker than fog, it was born in the sweat and soul of the people, men with calloused hands on brass instruments, women with honeyed voices that could make a crowded room go still. The notes rose into the night air like laughter, like memory, like something the world had been waiting for but didn't yet understand. It spread northward to Chicago, Kansas City, New York, carried by trains filled with musicians chasing dreams and gamblers chasing fortune. The sound found its way into every corner, from the elegant ballrooms of the rich to the backstreet clubs hidden behind unmarked doors. There was something both sinful and holy about it, something that made people forget themselves. Even those who frowned at its wildness could not escape it for long. It crept into the air like perfume, impossible to contain. On warm nights, when the windows were open and the city hummed like a living creature, you could hear the distant thump of a drum, the moan of a saxophone, the low murmur of a bass, all blending with the heartbeat of the age. People began to move differently, talk differently, even breathe differently. Women who once danced with measured grace now swayed with freedom, their fringed dresses shimmering in candlelight, their laughter echoing louder than propriety allowed. Men, loosened by whiskey and the promise of something new, clapped along, tapping shoes on wooden floors that vibrated with the pulse of change. The music was intoxicating, not because it was perfect, but because it was alive. It bent rules, blurred lines, turned mistakes into beauty. Every note seemed to say, forget the past, live now, this moment will never come again. And so they did. The war was behind them, the future unimagined, and the present bright, loud, defiant was all that mattered. In smoky clubs, where the lights hung low, couples leaned close, faces inches apart, eyes half closed, as the trumpet cried out like a lover's confession. The air was thick with the smell of gin and cigar smoke, perfume and sweat, laughter and longing. Outside, the streets glowed with the reflected light of neon signs and street lamps, as if the city itself was breathing in rhythm with the music. Radios, now the pride of every home, carried the sound to those who couldn't be there. Farmers in Kansas listening through static, widows in Ohio swaying softly in their kitchens, children falling asleep to melodies they didn't yet understand but would never forget. The nation was united not by politics or faith, but by rhythm. Jazz was the anthem of freedom, messy, unpredictable, beautiful. It gave voice to those who had long been unheard, especially black musicians, whose genius shaped the soul of the decade. Their music carried the pain and pride of generations. And though the world still bore its cruel divisions, for a few fleeting moments in a dark club or a crowded hall, everyone danced the same. It was equality in motion, a democracy of rhythm where money and status didn't matter as much as the way you could move. The Charleston, the shimmy, the black-bottom dances that looked wild to older eyes, but felt like release to the young, filled the nights with laughter and abandon. And as people danced, they forgot about the laws outside, about prohibition and moral codes, about the boundaries that once defined their lives. The music erased them all. In the morning, the streets would be quiet again, cigarette butts crushed on the cobblestones, broken glasses swept from doorways, the faint echo of a trumpet still hanging in the air, like the ghost of joy. But for those who had been there, who had felt the floor tremble beneath their feet and the sound crawl beneath their skin, the world was never the same again. Jazz had changed something inside them, something they couldn't name. It wasn't just a sound. It was a mirror showing America who it was becoming, restless, daring, alive. Record stores began to open on every block, their windows displaying gleaming black discs that promised the future. Young people saved coins just to bring home a song they could play over and over until the grooves wore thin. For many, it was their first taste of ownership over art, of holding in their hands a piece of the age's heartbeat. And with every spin, the world outside faded, replaced by rhythm, by movement, by a sense that life itself was a kind of dance. By the mid-1920s, the whole country seemed to move in time with that invisible drumbeat. The train whistles sounded like saxophones. The typewriters clicked in syncopation. Even the rain seemed to fall to a rhythm. Jazz was not only in the clubs. It was in the streets, in the factories, in the hearts of those who were learning to hope again. The music didn't ask for permission. It simply entered, and once it did, it never left. The decade began to hum with it, restless, radiant, forever on the edge of something new. And if you stood in the middle of the city at night, just listening, you could almost hear the sound of an entire nation exhaling, finally alive after too long in silence. It started with a whisper, a name spoken softly in the alley behind a bakery, a knock in a pattern only the brave or the foolish knew. Prohibition had turned the nation dry on paper, but thirst doesn't obey laws, and desire has always found a way. In the 1920s, America became a country of secrets, and the heart of those secrets beat in the speakeasies, hidden places where the world's edges blurred and rules dissolved, like sugar in gin. Some were grand, tucked behind velvet curtains in hotel basements, lit by chandeliers stolen from the past. Others were nothing more than cellars with creaking floors and the smell of damp brick, where jazz musicians played with one eye on the door. Every night, men in fedoras and women with bobbed hair descended into these shadows, slipping from the cold, polite world above into something warmer, freer, more alive. The air down there was thick with cigarette smoke, with the scent of bootleg liquor, with laughter that teetered on the edge of hysteria. In one corner, a pianist's fingers danced lightly across ivory keys. In another, someone whispered the latest rumor about a new gin shipment coming through from Canada. The law said alcohol was forbidden, but the law felt far away here, like a parent no one listened to anymore. What mattered was the music, the movement, the thrill of doing what shouldn't be done. Bartenders became magicians, mixing bathtub gin and homemade whiskey with lemon and honey, disguising the bite of the cheap spirits with sweetness and citrus. Glasses clinked, eyes met, and somewhere between the piano notes and the hum of voices, people remembered how to feel alive. The speakeasies were small worlds within the world, entire galaxies built out of rebellion and rhythm, spinning in candlelight. They were not just about drink. They were about escape. The country was pretending to be pure, moral, restrained. But in the cellars beneath its cities, a different truth was being written, one of yearning, of freedom, of wild joy hidden behind locked doors. Some nights the police raided them, and the lights went out in a flurry of shouts and breaking glass. But even then, the patrons often laughed as they ran into the night, exhilarated by the chase. To be caught was almost to be baptized into the secret. Everyone knew someone who could get you in. The code words changed every week. Joe sent me, "Tell the owl you're thirsty. Ask for Mary." Behind fake walls, trap doors, and revolving bookcases, America's greatest open secret grew stronger. There were stories of gangsters financing entire networks of these hidden havens, their fortunes flowing from the rivers of illicit liquor. They dressed sharp, spoke softly, and made sure the right people were paid to look away. In the speakeasies they controlled, the atmosphere crackled with danger, not enough to terrify, just enough to excite. Dancers spun faster, drinks flowed freer, and the band played louder, as if daring the world to try to stop them. There was an electric thrill in knowing that every glass raised was a small act of defiance. For the flapper women, it was liberation itself. Short skirts, short hair, long nights. They smoked cigarettes in long holders, laughed without apology, and danced until dawn, free from the eyes that judged them outside. For the men, it was a place to forget, to let the rhythm drown the memories of war, of work, of ordinary life. Together they formed a new tribe, bound not by law or class, but by the shared knowledge of something secret and forbidden. The sound of laughter in a speakeasy was different. It was lower, warmer, edged with a kind of relief. People leaned closer, their faces half hidden in the dim light, their voices hushed not from fear but from intimacy. Even the music seemed to play differently, underground. The saxophones cried a little softer, the drums pulsed like heartbeats, and the piano seemed to whisper between notes. In those small rooms, dreams mingled with the scent of gin and perfume, and for a few hours, the outside world vanished. Some speakeasies became legends, places like the 21 Club in New York or the Green Mill in Chicago, where the famous and the forgotten brushed shoulders without knowing or caring who was who. Gangsters might sit 2 tables away from poets. Movie stars might dance with shop clerks. The line between rich and poor, between sinner and saint, blurred until no one could see it anymore. That was the true magic of it, not the drink, not even the music, but the equality of the night. In a world obsessed with control, these hidden rooms were proof that the human spirit would always find its rebellion. Outside, the streets grew silent, snow sometimes falling gently on the dark city, muffling footsteps. But beneath the surface, America pulsed with secret laughter, the sound of glasses clinking behind hidden walls. And as the clock ticked toward morning, the people inside didn't want to leave. knowing that when the lights came on, they'd return to a quieter, duller world. So they stayed until the very last note, until the last drop, until the last whisper faded. Some would say later that the speakeasies were immoral, corrupt, dangerous, but those who had been there would only smile and say they had lived. The truth was simpler. They had danced through the darkness, and in doing so, they had become the decade itself, bright, reckless, unforgettable. While music filled the nights and laughter echoed behind hidden doors, another rhythm pulsed beneath it all, sharper, colder, and far more dangerous. It was the rhythm of boots on pavement, of car engines purring in alleyways, of whispered deals made under street lamps that flickered like uncertain stars. Crime had always lived in the corners of the city, but during Prohibition, it stepped into the spotlight, wearing fine suits and polished shoes. The gangsters of the 1920s were not the shadowy thieves of the past. They were businessmen now, ruthless entrepreneurs of the forbidden. With the stroke of a law, the government had handed them an empire: alcohol. The one thing everyone wanted, but no one could have. They moved fast, faster than anyone could stop them. Truckloads of illegal whiskey rolled in from Canada. Rum slipped quietly across the Caribbean waters, and secret distilleries bubbled away in barns and basements from coast to coast. Money flowed like the very liquor they sold, and with it came power. The kind that made even politicians whisper before speaking their names. In cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit, new kings rose, men like Al Capone, whose smile could be as charming as it was terrifying. To the public, they were both villains and legends, criminals and folk heroes. Newspapers printed their names with both fear and fascination, while the people who drank their liquor toasted them in secret gratitude. For every glass raised in a speakeasy, there was a trail of danger behind it. Trucks chased through the night by men, bribes exchanged in hotel lobbies, warehouses burned to ash in rival wars. The air of the decade shimmered with risk, and beneath its glitter, blood ran quietly, hidden beneath the rhythm of the jazz. Yet, even in that violence, there was a strange order, an underworld society with its own rules, its own loyalty, its own sense of justice. The men who ruled it were cold, but not thoughtless, cruel, but not without code. They saw themselves not as criminals, but as suppliers of joy in a world that had outlawed happiness. And perhaps, in some twisted way, they were right. Their clubs gave the cities their pulse, their money built the streets, and their stories became the mythology of modern America. You could find them anywhere. The light was dim and the music loud, sitting in the corner booth with a glass untouched, surrounded by men who never smiled. They were ghosts of their own making, dressed in silk and fear. Their eyes were sharp, their words careful. To cross one was to vanish, and everyone knew it. Yet still, people admired them. There was something magnetic about their certainty, their control, their defiance of the law that everyone secretly despised. They lived fast, but they lived free, and in a decade built on speed that was the ultimate temptation. Outside, the cities grew taller, louder, brighter, skyscrapers climbing into the clouds, while the streets below became rivers of movement. Cars lined up at curbsides, their headlights cutting through the mist like surf. In that glowing chaos, the gangsters moved like shadows, unseen but everywhere. They owned the night and all its secrets. Even the lawmen who hunted them were not immune. More than a few wore the same perfume of corruption. Justice had become a game to one, played not in courts, but in alleys and backrooms, where envelopes changed hands and loyalty was sold in silence. The newspapers called it the war on crime, but to most it felt like a dance, a grim, hypnotic waltz between law and lawlessness. And still the people drank, laughed, and danced, pretending not to see the cracks in their golden world. The jazz covered everything: the gunfire, the betrayal, the screams muffled by city rain. The night went on as if the danger were just another note in the music. But if you looked closely, you could see it, the fear behind the eyes of the bartenders. The quick glances exchanged when unfamiliar faces entered the club. The way laughter sometimes stopped too suddenly when the door opened. The gangsters had built an empire out of shadows, and everyone lived inside it, knowingly or not. Yet there was a strange beauty in it all, in the way darkness and light coexisted, in the way danger made every heartbeat feel more alive. The decade was a paradox, a dream built on crime, a song played in minor keys. Some said America had lost its soul in those years, but others believed it had simply learned what its soul truly was: wild, hungry, defiant, alive. The gangsters, for all their cruelty, were only reflections of that spirit. They were the mirror held up to a nation that wanted everything and feared nothing. And as the decade roared on, their legend grew louder than their gunfire, echoing in every city, whispered in every bar. They became stories, and stories, after all, never die. By the middle of the decade, the 1920s had learned how to sparkle. The cities shone like jeweled kingdoms, and every evening felt like the opening scene of a film that never quite ended. New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, each one a heartbeat in the restless body of a nation chasing its own reflection. Neon signs hummed in the fog, streetcars rattled through canyons of steel, and shop windows gleamed with silk dresses and gold watches that promised a happiness you could almost buy. To walk down Fifth Avenue at dusk was to feel time speeding up. Everything moved, everyone hurried, and no one wanted to be left behind. Women, once quiet and confined, now strutted in their cloche hats and fur collars. Cigarettes balanced like crowns between painted fingers. Their laughter cut through the evening air, light and fearless. Men in sleek suits hurried from offices to nightclubs, the day's sweat traded for the night's cologne. They talked about stocks, about success, about futures that seemed limitless. Money had become more than a need. It was a performance, a way of existing. The stock market, once a mystery to most, now felt like a carnival, spinning fortunes out of thin air. Radios crackled with jazz, newspapers buzzed with optimism, and somewhere, always, a new building was rising into the clouds. Yet beneath that glitter, the streets told a different story. The doorman who opened the golden doors, the waiters who carried champagne on trembling trays, the factory workers whose fingers bled to make the goods that filled the stores. They lived in the shadows of the shine. The decade belonged to both of them, the ones who danced and the ones who watched. In the daylight, factories hummed, offices filled with typewriters clicking in rhythmic chatter, and the air smelled faintly of ink, oil, and ambition. People worked harder than ever, not just for money, but for the dream of appearing successful. It was the decade of illusions, of making life look better than it felt. Photographs, replaced memory. Clothes became personality. Laughter became currency. Parties grew louder, dresses shorter, drinks stronger. And somewhere in that endless celebration, exhaustion began to bloom. It was easy to miss it beneath the glitter, the quiet weariness behind the painted smiles, the way laughter sometimes sounded hollow by midnight. The cities never slept, but the people within them began to dream less. The glamour was real, yes, bright lights, fast cars, the endless rhythm of jazz, but it came with a cost, paid quietly in loneliness and longing. Not everyone could keep up with the speed of modern life. The farmers in the Midwest watched the cities from afar, their fields drying under the unrelenting sun, their old world fading. The workers who built the towers could barely afford to look at them. But even so, the dream of the roaring city called to everyone like a song too beautiful to resist. Hollywood fed that dream, turning ordinary faces into gods of the silver screen. In the darkness of movie theaters, audiences sat mesmerized as the flickering light painted their faces with impossible stories. There, the world was perfect, clean, dramatic, full of love and victory. The people clapped when the hero kissed the heroine, then stepped back into a world that looked nothing like it. The contrast didn't matter. What mattered was the escape. Glamour became America's most intoxicating addiction, stronger even than the liquor hidden in the speakeasy. To be glamorous was to matter, to exist beyond the smallness of everyday life. And so, people learned to pose, to dress, to perform. Every evening was a stage, every mirror a chance to believe. Yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the streets emptied and the music finally stopped, you could feel the truth underneath the grit, beneath the gloss, the fatigue behind the fashion. A janitor sweeping confetti from the floor of a ballroom would pause, looking at the gold and silver papers scattered like fallen stars, and think how beautiful the night must have been for others. A flapper, removing her beads and heels in a silent apartment, might wonder when the fun had started to feel like work. The city, for all its noise, had moments of perfect stillness, then moments when the lights flickered and the silence felt almost sacred. It was as if the decade itself took a deep breath, unsure how long it could keep shining so brightly before burning out. But for now, no one cared. The music would play again tomorrow. The champagne would bubble, and the dream would continue, as dazzling and fragile as a spark in the dark. When the music faded and the lights went out, the silence came like a tide, slow and deep, washing over the shining cities that had danced themselves breathless. By morning, the laughter of the night before felt distant, like something half-remembered from a dream. The streets, once alive with music and cars, lay quiet under a thin veil of fog. Newspapers fluttered along the sidewalks, carrying headlines of fortunes made and lives ruined, printed in the same careless ink. In the upper floors of glittering hotels, people slept behind drawn curtains, men who had toasted to their success, now turning restlessly in beds too large, women who had danced until dawn, now staring at the ceiling, wondering why they still felt empty. The 1920s, for all its noise and brilliance, had begun to echo with loneliness. The decade had promised freedom, but freedom, it turned out, could feel like falling. So many had run from something, from small towns, from memories of war, from families they no longer recognized, and in the bright anonymity of the cities, They thought they could reinvent themselves. But reinvention came at a cost. The faces in the mirror changed faster than the souls behind them could keep up. A woman who had once been a schoolteacher in Kansas might now spend her nights singing in a smoky cabaret, her voice soft but tired, her laughter practiced. A man who had once fought in France might now drive a taxi through Manhattan, his hands still remembering the weight of a rifle as he steered through the chaos. The city had no room for reflection. It demanded movement, speed, forgetting. Yet at dawn, when the streets were empty and the only sound was the slow clatter of a milk cart on cobblestones, those forgotten memories returned, like ghosts slipping quietly back into the room. They were the hidden heartbeat of the decade, the ache beneath the rhythm. For all its glamour, the 1920s was a generation of survivors pretending to be dreamers. The war had ended, yes, but the wounds had not. People had learned to dance, to keep from remembering. Behind every smile was a flicker of fear. Behind every toast, a whisper of loss. They built towers of steel to forget the trenches of mud. They filled their nights with jazz so they wouldn't hear the silence. And yet, no matter how loud the music grew, the quiet always found a way back in. You could see it in the small things, in the way people clung to each other in the dim light of speakeasies, in the letters never sent, in the faces turned away when the morning sun rose too bright. The lost were everywhere, not just the poor or the broken, but the rich too, their loneliness gilded but no less real. Money could buy the illusion of joy, but not its permanence. In a penthouse high above the city, a man might sit alone with a drink, staring at the skyline, trying to convince himself that the view was enough. In a boarding house on the edge of town, a young woman might hold an old photograph, wondering when her own story had slipped away. The decade glittered, but its brilliance often hid the cracks beneath. Even the music began to change, slower now, sadder, as if it knew what was coming. The jazz still played, but there was something haunted in it, a melancholy between the notes, a weariness that no melody could disguise. The people who danced to it smiled still, but their eyes looked past the moment, searching for something they couldn't name. It was as if the entire country sensed the fragility of its joy, the thin ice beneath its golden reflection. They didn't speak of it, not yet, but it lingered in the air like the last note of a song. The artists felt it first, painting faces that seemed too beautiful and too sad all at once. The writers felt it too, their stories filled with parties that ended in silence and dreams that turned to dust. It was the age of beauty touched by decay, of light haunted by shadow. In every city, there were people who stood at windows long after midnight, watching the streets below and wondering if anyone else felt the same emptiness. They had chased happiness like a flame, only to find it flickered and burned away too quickly. And still, the world told them to smile, to dance, to keep moving. So they did. They filled the void with more laughter, more champagne, more motion. The parties grew bigger, the noise louder, as if trying to drown the quiet truth that no one really knew where they were going anymore. The dream of endless freedom had become a maze, glittering but hollow. Yet even in that sadness, there was something strangely beautiful, the fragile courage of people trying to stay alive through joy. The way they refused to stop searching for meaning even as it slipped through their fingers. In the end, the 1920s was not only about excess and rebellion. It was about yearning, a whole generation reaching for something just out of reach, something that might make them feel whole again. And though they would never find it, the search itself became the story. The echoes of the lost filled the decade like a melody you couldn't forget, soft, sorrowful, endlessly human. By the end of the decade, America stood at the edge of something it didn't yet see, caught between the brilliance of its dreams and the weight of its own illusions. The cities still roared, the music still played, and the lights still burned through the night. But beneath that restless glow, there was an unease no one wanted to name. It began softly, a missed payment here, a factory slowing there, whispers on Wall Street that not everything golden was pure. Yet, on the surface, everything gleamed brighter than ever. Automobiles lined the streets in long, shining rows. Radios hummed in every home, and advertisements promised happiness in boxes, bottles, and buttons. The air smelled of progress, of gasoline and ambition, and people inhaled it like perfume. To be modern was to be fearless. Men bought stocks as casually as cigars. Women ordered dresses from Paris by mail, and the world seemed to move faster each morning. The nation was no longer healing, it was ascending. Everyone said so. Everyone believed it. But belief, like champagne, has bubbles that burst when the bottle runs dry. The markets soared higher, too high, and though some sensed the danger, few wanted to stop the dance. How could they, when the music was still playing? To question it felt unpatriotic, almost cruel, as if doubting the dream might make it vanish. So they smiled wider, worked longer, spent faster. New buildings pierced the sky, their steel bones glittering in sunlight. From the top floors of Manhattan's newest towers, the city looked infinite, a living monument to human ambition. And yet, if you stood there long enough, you could feel the wind whisper through the gaps, carrying the faint scent of something ending. The parties grew louder to drown it out. Millionaires threw galas that lasted until dawn, where champagne flowed like rivers and orchestras played until their fingers ached. Cameras flashed, pearls shimmered, promises of forever floated in smoky air. But even as laughter filled the rooms, some eyes turned quietly toward the windows, toward the skyline that never stopped growing, and wondered how long it could all last. For every bright light in the city, there was a shadow forming just behind it. In the countryside, farmers watched prices fall, their fields yielding crops that no one could afford to buy. In the factories, workers stood longer hours for smaller pay, their hands still moving, but their faith beginning to falter. In the markets, the numbers danced like ghosts, beautiful, meaningless, unstoppable. Still, no one spoke the word collapse. They said expansion, opportunity, prosperity, as if language itself could keep the tide from turning. But tides do not ask permission. The optimism of the 1920s was a fire that burned too hot, too long, and though the flames dazzled, the smoke was already rising. Those who had built their lives on paper fortunes began to feel the ground shift beneath their feet. Banks stretched thin, credit ran deeper than anyone understood, and the American dream began to wobble, like a spinning coin about to fall flat. Yet, if you walked through Times Square at night, you'd never know it. The signs still glowed, the cars still honked, the laughter still rang through the streets. People lived as if the future were guaranteed, as if nothing bad could touch a decade so beautiful. The illusion held, fragile but unbroken. And in that fragile beauty lay something heartbreakingly human, the refusal to stop believing in happiness, even when the walls began to crack. There was hope, still, fierce and naive, glowing like the last ember in a dying fire. A young couple might sit on a park bench, sharing a cigarette, whispering dreams of the house they would one day own. A man might step out of a speakeasy at dawn, squinting at the rising sun, certain that tomorrow would be brighter than today. It was the edge of tomorrow, glittering, trembling, magnificent. The sound of jazz still drifted through the night air, but if you listened closely, it carried a strange melancholy, like laughter fading in another room. The decade had lived so fast that it forgot to look back, and now, without realizing it, it was running out of breath. Yet there was grace in that fall, a kind of tragic poetry in the way it all shimmered before it broke. The people of the 1920s didn't know they were living in an ending. They thought they were standing at the start of forever. And maybe that's what made it beautiful, the unknowing, the innocent arrogance of hope. For them, tomorrow was not a threat but a promise. The world had changed so much in 10 short years, from war to peace, from silence to song, from scarcity to excess, that they believed change could only ever mean progress. No one imagined that the same engines of growth could reverse, that the same towers could cast shadows long enough to swallow everything beneath them. But history moves quietly, and while the people danced, history was already turning the page. The decade was nearly over, but its heartbeat still thundered, steady, defiant, unaware of its own fragility. In the distance, the 1930s waited like a storm behind a painted sky. But for now, the party went on. The champagne fizzed, the music soared, the lights refused to dim. America was still dancing on the edge of tomorrow, and tomorrow, patient and inevitable, was almost here. The fall didn't happen with thunder or fire, but with a whisper, a quiet tremor beneath the marble floors of Wall Street, a shiver that passed unnoticed through the laughter of crowded cafes. In the autumn of 1929, the sky over New York was perfectly blue, the kind of color that made people believe everything was fine. Brokers still rushed through the streets with cigars and confidence. Newspapers still printed numbers that looked like magic, and ordinary people still bought dreams on borrowed money. But beneath the glitter, the system had begun to tremble. Stocks that had climbed endlessly started to slide, gently at first, like sand slipping between fingers. A few men frowned, a few women hesitated to place their orders. But the music of prosperity played on, too loud for doubt to be heard. Then, one morning, it happened, the fall no one expected, the collapse everyone feared. On October 29th, the market shattered. It began as a murmur on the trading floor and ended as a roar that echoed through the world. Papers flew through the air like frightened birds. Men shouted until their voices broke. Some wept openly. Others stood in stunned silence as the numbers that once made them rich vanished in seconds. Outside, crowds gathered, staring up at ticker boards that blinked like dying stars. The dream had fallen, not with an explosion, but with a sigh. And when the dust settled, nothing looked the same. Overnight fortunes turned to debts, savings became ashes, and America woke to a silence it hadn't known in a decade. The lights of Broadway still burned, but they flickered now, uncertain, as if aware that the city's heartbeat had changed. Banks closed their doors, their marble pillars suddenly cold and useless. Families who had spoken of endless tomorrows now spoke only of rent, of bread, of how to make it through the week. The air that had once smelled of gasoline and champagne now smelled of dust and coal smoke. The laughter of the 20s, bright and reckless, had dissolved into something softer, the hush of disbelief. In small towns, men gathered in barber shops and whispered about the market crash, though few of them truly understood what it meant. They only knew that the orders had stopped coming, that the factory whistles had gone quiet, that neighbors were moving away in the night. In cities, the same story unfolded in sharper detail. Men who had owned stocks now sold apples on street corners. Women who had worn silk gloves now mended old coats by candlelight. Hope, which had once been the nation's heartbeat, was now a fragile thing, flickering like a match in the wind. But even in that darkness, there was something strangely human, a resilience born not from wealth but from necessity. Churches filled again, not with sinners seeking salvation, but with people seeking comfort. Soup kitchens appeared like quiet sanctuaries, their lines stretching longer with each passing week. The songs changed, too. Jazz softened, slowing its frantic rhythm, turning into blues, the kind of music that remembers joy but speaks with sorrow. Radios no longer promised the future. They comforted the present. News traveled slower, heavier, and for the first time in years, people listened with both ears. The party was over, and America was learning how to live without noise. In the mansions of the rich, silence settled like dust over grand pianos and crystal chandeliers. Many of those who had ruled the decade disappeared, some into foreign countries, others into despair. But the working class, those who had never truly shared in the excess, found a strange strength in survival. They planted gardens in empty lots, repaired shoes instead of buying new ones, and rediscovered the quiet dignity of small victories. The cities, once engines of endless motion, now moved slower, their streets less crowded, their voices lower. And yet there was a kind of peace in it. For the first time in a long time, people began to look at one another again, not as competitors in a race, but as fellow travelers on the same uncertain road. Children still played, though their toys were fewer. Lovers still met in the park, though the benches were colder. Life, though harder, continued. The roaring had stopped, and in its place came a hum, the quiet rhythm of endurance. Historians would later call it the Great Depression, but in the hearts of those who lived it, it was simply the long silence. And within that silence, there was beauty, the kind that comes when the world is stripped bare, when all that remains is the fragile humanity that had been hidden beneath the noise. It was the fall of fortune, yes, but also the beginning of a deeper truth, that even in ruin, life persists. The same sun that once glinted off champagne glasses now warmed the hands of those who built fires from scraps. The same streets that had hosted parades now echoed with footsteps searching for work. The same sky that had seen planes and dreams take flight now held a quieter kind of hope, not the loud, golden hope of the 20s, but a gentler, steadier one. The decade of speed had ended in stillness, and in that stillness, America began to remember what it meant to stand still, to breathe, to endure. Chicago, once the city of restless rhythm, had fallen into a strange, uneasy silence. The wind that once carried the laughter of speakeasies now whispered through empty alleys and between brick walls blackened by soot. the same streets that had pulsed with jazz and bootleggers just a few years before were now haunted by the hollow sound of footsteps, men in worn coats, collars pulled high against the cold, walking nowhere in particular. The stockyards still smoked faintly in the distance, but even their fires seemed smaller, quieter. The city that had once defied the law now bowed beneath the weight of hunger. It was winter, and the snow came early that year, soft and endless, covering the streets like a white shroud. In the mornings, you could see lines of people standing outside the soup kitchens before dawn, their breath rising like ghosts in the air. The lucky ones got a bowl of thin stew and a piece of bread. The rest went hungry and told themselves they'd try again tomorrow. Yet, in that silence, there was something powerful, a slow, enduring rhythm beneath the despair, the stubborn heartbeat of a city that refused to die. The gangsters who had once ruled the underworld with guns and gin now found themselves relics of another time. Al Capone, once the king of Chicago, had traded tailored suits for a prison uniform. The headlines that once sang his name now whispered it with a kind of disbelief, as if the city couldn't quite imagine itself without him. The speakeasies were gone, their doors boarded, their glasses shattered. In their place stood small diners, flickering with weak neon, serving cheap coffee to men who used to drink champagne. A generation that had lived too fast was now learning to move slowly. The music changed, too. The saxophones that once screamed rebellion now wept softly in basement bars, their notes curling like smoke in the dim air. Musicians played for coins, their fingers numb but steady, their songs heavy with memory. There was no more roaring, only remembering. Yet, even here, life found strange beauty. Children still built snowmen from the gray slush, their laughter echoing off the cold stone buildings like distant bells. Women hung laundry indoors, whispering prayers that the power would stay on through the night. Men gathered in groups, sharing cigarettes and silence, speaking only when necessary, because what was there to say when the whole world seemed paused? The L trains still rattled overhead, but the cars were nearly empty, and their metallic groan sounded almost like a sigh. At night, when the city lights flickered weakly against the mist, Chicago looked like a dream, a ghost of its former self. But within that ghost, something real remained: resilience. The city had always been built on survival. Fire, prohibition, crime, it had lived through them all. And now, even in poverty, it endured. There were stories of kindness, too, small and quiet, hidden beneath the hardship. A baker leaving extra bread on the window ledge for the children who passed by. A woman sewing coats from old curtains for neighbors she barely knew. A policeman turning his back as a hungry man stole an apple from a cart. These were the acts that kept the city breathing, not the grand speeches, but the quiet mercies that no one wrote down. Chicago had lost its noise, but not its soul. And in that stillness, it began to remember what it was made of. The skyline still stood tall, though the lights inside those towers were fewer. The lake still shimmered beneath the gray sky, its waves moving slow and patient. The wind still sang through the empty streets, carrying with it the faintest trace of old jazz, not loud enough to dance to, but soft enough to remember. The decade that had begun with champagne and confetti was ending with coffee and silence. Yet, in that silence, there was something cleansing. It was as if the city were exhaling at last, letting go of the illusions that had once blinded it. People began to look inward, to value the small things: a warm meal, a friendly face, a quiet morning when nothing went wrong. The city had changed, but maybe, in some strange way, it was healing. The darkness forced people to see one another again, to reach out in ways they hadn't when the lights were bright. The bootleggers were gone, the clubs were closed, the laughter had faded, but the human spirit, bruised and tired, still glowed faintly beneath it all. Chicago was no longer the roaring city of sin and sound. It was a city of whispers, of endurance, of hope pressed thin but unbroken. And in that, there was a quiet kind of grace, the kind that only comes when everything else has been stripped away. The wind kept blowing, as it always had, carrying with it the scent of smoke and snow and memory, sweeping through the empty streets like a lullaby for the forgotten. Freedom, in those years after the fall, was no longer the glittering promise it had been in the roaring days of jazz and champagne. It was something quieter, humbler, almost painful. It had to be earned now, not bought. The crash had taken more than money. It had stolen illusion, pride, the fragile certainty that the good times would last forever. Across America, the meaning of freedom changed, reshaped by hardship and hunger. Men who had once measured liberty in luxury now found it in the small grace of surviving another day. The price of freedom was no longer paid in dollars, but in endurance. In towns across the Midwest, people gathered in empty barns, trading stories instead of goods, their voices carrying through the dust like old songs. They spoke of the past, not to mourn it, but to remember what they had lost and what still remained. The land that had once yielded golden wheat now lay fallow, cracked beneath a sky that seemed to have forgotten rain. Dust storms swept across the plains, turning the air brown, choking crops, burying fences, and covering entire towns in a soft, cruel blanket. The farmers who had once been proud stewards of the earth now stood helpless at their doors, watching the wind steal everything they owned. Some packed their belongings onto trucks and set out west, chasing a rumor that California was still green. Others stayed, their faith rooted deeper than their fields. They learned to tie wet cloth over their mouths, to sweep the dust from their dinner plates, to pray for clouds that never came. Yet even there, in that wasteland, life persisted. Children laughed in the dust, as if pretending it was snow. Women sang to keep the fear away. The sky might have turned against them, but the human spirit did not. In the cities, freedom meant something else. It meant standing in long lines for work that might never come. It meant swallowing pride. It meant sharing what little you had. The streets of New York, once bright with neon and motion, were now lined with men selling apples for a nickel, each one a silent symbol of what had been lost. They called it the Apple Seller Army, and though the sight was pitiful, there was dignity in it, a refusal to surrender completely to despair. Freedom, in its purest form, was survival. And yet, beneath the hardship, there was a strange kind of awakening. People began to see one another again. The invisible walls that had separated rich from poor, success from failure, began to crumble. Neighbors shared meals. Strangers helped strangers. In the absence of plenty, kindness became currency. It was not the freedom the nation had celebrated in the 20s, loud, gilded, and brash, but it was real, and it cost dearly. Out of the rubble of the old dream, a new understanding was forming. that freedom without compassion was only loneliness dressed in gold. The decade that had once roared with excess was now whispering lessons in humility. It was as if America itself were learning to breathe again, slowly, painfully, after nearly drowning in its own ambition. The government began to stir, trying to mend the broken pieces of its promise. New policies, new voices, new hope began to ripple through the despair. Franklin Roosevelt's words crackled through the radio. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And for the first time in years, people listened. They believed, not because they were certain, but because they needed to. The fires of the Depression had burned away the illusions of invincibility, leaving behind a quieter, truer strength. People began to rebuild, not skyscrapers or fortunes, but communities, values, meaning. It was a slow, uneven process, like learning to walk again after a long sleep. Some never recovered, their spirits too heavy with loss. But others rose, fragile yet determined, carrying with them the wisdom carved from suffering. They understood now that freedom was not the absence of pain, but the courage to endure it. It was the right to hope when there was no reason to plant seeds, even when the rain refused to come. Across the land, the sound of hammers returned, not in the frantic rhythm of progress, but in the patient beat of repair. Railways hummed again, factories coughed back to life. And though the wages were meager, the pride in earning them was immense. America was scarred but alive. The jazz was softer now, the laughter quieter, but it was real. Freedom had been bought again, not by the wealthy or the reckless, but by those who had nothing left to lose. It had cost sweat, humility, and faith, a high price, but one worth paying. As the decade waned, the country began to lift its head, the first fragile green shoots breaking through the dust. The people were different now. Their dreams were smaller, perhaps, but sturdier. They no longer wanted everything. They only wanted enough. And in that modest hope lay something sacred, the rebirth of gratitude. They understood, at last, that freedom was not about having more, but about being enough together. The night was long, but dawn was coming. And when it came, the light would fall not on glittering towers or golden cars, but on the faces of those who had endured, tired, lined, beautiful in their resilience. The price of freedom had been steep, but it had been paid in full. There came a night in the mid-30s when the hum of the radio, that faithful heartbeat of American evenings, began to fade. Not suddenly, but gradually, like the last echo of a song carried away by the wind. For a decade, it had been the voice of the nation, the laughter of vaudeville comedians, the breaking news that made hearts tremble, the croon of love songs that drifted through curtains into quiet streets. But now, in towns across the country, people were turning the dials and finding more static than melody. The world was changing again, and for the first time since the crash, the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt uncertain, like the breath before a storm. Families sat in living rooms, waiting for familiar voices that did not come. Mothers looked at the radio as though it were a friend who had stopped writing back. The air felt heavier, the stillness pressing against the walls. Outside, autumn winds shook the last leaves from the trees, and the scent of smoke from wood stoves mingled with rain. America, that restless dreamer, was holding its breath again, listening for something it could not name. In those silent evenings, people rediscovered the art of conversation. Without the radio's chatter, families spoke to each other again, softly at first, then freely. They told old stories that had been buried beneath static, stories of small triumphs, lost loves, and journeys that had shaped them. The living room became the new theater, the porch became a stage. The nation that once sought escape in sound was now finding meaning in quiet voices and long pauses. Fathers taught their sons to whittle. Mothers hummed lullabies from their own childhoods. The sound of spoons against teacups replaced the brass swing of city bands. And in that stillness, something unexpected grew. Connection. People realized how much of life they had missed while chasing the next song, the next joke, the next distraction. The silence became a mirror, and in it they saw themselves tired, changed, but still standing. The loss of the radio was not the end of comfort. It was the rediscovery of presence. Still, the world outside was restless. Factories had reopened. Cities were stirring again, and the first whispers of another war were floating across the Atlantic. The newspapers spoke cautiously, trying not to alarm, but the headlines carried weight. Europe was a storm brewing beyond the horizon, and America could feel the wind shift. Young men, too young to remember the last great war, looked at maps with curiosity rather than fear. The rhythm of recovery that had defined the 30s began to quicken again, faintly at first, a pulse returning to a patient, long thought still. Radios that had gone quiet flickered back to life, this time with new voices, not the carefree entertainers of old, but reporters, solemn and steady, describing the movements of armies, the rise of men whose names would soon darken history. The static gave way to the drumbeat of reality. People listened, breath held, to voices from faraway cities, London, Paris, Berlin. The silence that had healed them was now filled once more with noise, but this time it was the sound of the world turning toward uncertainty. Even so, in the small towns far from Washington and New York, life clung to its slower rhythm. On Sunday mornings, the smell of baking bread drifted through open windows. Children walked to school with books bound by string, their laughter echoing against the fences. Farmers still rose before dawn, listening not to the radio, but to the first chirp of birds. And in those moments, before the headlines intruded, America felt timeless again, a place suspended between what had been and what was coming. The people knew that the world was changing beyond their fields and rivers, but they had learned the value of the hour before dawn, the minute of peace before the noise returned. That quiet was their inheritance, born from hardship and kept alive by memory. When the radios did speak again, they sounded different. The voices were older, wiser, and slower. They spoke of rebuilding, of the government's new projects, of art and books and music that reflected not glamour but resilience. Listeners noticed how even advertisements had changed, no longer promises of endless happiness, but assurances of stability, of quality, of endurance. The nation's heart had matured. The young woman who once danced through the 20s in sequins and pearls had become a mother, sitting by the fire, humming the same jazz tune to her child, her voice softer, but still carrying the rhythm of her youth. The wild dream had grown gentle, but it still dreamed. The radio, once the engine of excitement, had become the companion of reflection. As night deepened, the sound of rain on rooftops mixed with the faint static of distant stations. In many homes, the radio remained on even when no one was listening, a soft, comforting hum like a heartbeat in the dark. It reminded people that they were part of something larger, something connected by invisible threads of sound stretching from coast to coast. The radio waves carried stories, laughter, sorrow, and hope across mountains and plains, over rivers and through cities. And though the world beyond was uncertain, those invisible waves bound America together like a lullaby. Every voice, every song, every broadcast became part of a shared dream, fragile, imperfect, but alive. The silence had not killed the radio. It had given it soul. Outside, the country slept under a blanket of gray clouds. Trains moved through the distance, their whistles long and mournful. Somewhere, a soldier packed his bag, unaware that history was about to turn again. Somewhere else, a writer stayed, up late by lamplight, putting words to the feeling of a world caught between peace and fear. Somewhere, a woman looked at her child and whispered a prayer that the next decade would be kinder than the last. The dream of America, once loud and glittering, now glowed like a coal in the dark, dim, steady waiting. The silence had taught the nation patience. The noise to come would test that lesson. For now, in the stillness of that evening, the people rested. The hum of the last working radios filled the rooms like the sound of ocean waves. The stories drifted through the static of courage, of love, of the small acts that kept the world turning. And in every home, whether grand or humble, there was one shared truth. After everything that had happened, the world still had music left in it, even if it whispered instead of sang. The radios might fall silent, but the hearts that had once listened would never forget the sound.